Good weekend and welcome to Leading Edge. I'm Viviana Hurtado. This June, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down important and controversial decisions, but that was overshadowed by the announcement Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy would be retiring. Nominated by President Ronald Reagan, he has served more than 30 years. A Republican, he became an at times controversial and powerful swing vote on landmark cases. These include Citizens United, which protects the political speech of corporations and unions, including in election ads and lifted campaign spending limits, as well as the decision which legalized same-sex marriage. I welcome Dr. Sam Nelson. He's the chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Toledo. He also specializes in the Supreme Court. So Kennedy, Dr. Nelson, pardon me, seemed like a liberal because some of those landmark votes, but was he really?
He wasn't really a liberal. He was a liberal on gay rights and marriage equality, a handful of a couple of other things he aligned with the liberal justices on the Supreme Court, but really he was a very conservative justice who was persuadable in some areas. But I think it would be a mistake to ever think of him as a liberal. Conservatives were upset with some of the decisions that he signed on to.
So we saw in this session some real landmark cases, or at least some very controversial cases. We're talking about the president's travel ban on people from Muslim majority countries, ruling on public employees, all of this coming down within the last week or so. But let's talk about the future and why it is that the replacement of Justice Kennedy could be so important. We're talking about the climate change, gerrymandering, and the right to vote. These are some of those questions that really affect everybody in America and certainly here in Northwest Ohio.
Right. I mean, there's some really big substantive issues where now almost certainly Trump's nominee to replace Kennedy is going to be more conservative than Kennedy. Everybody on the short list of 25 is more conservative than Kennedy, which means John Roberts is now the middle justice. We know his views are well known, and in terms of voting rights, gerrymanders, environmental regulation, the rights of gays and lesbians and so on, we're going to see a shift in a more conservative direction. Also, the replacement is probably going to be around 50 years old and serve on the court for another 30 years, replacing Kennedy.
Let's go back to Justice Roberts, because there oftentimes has been an evolution because the justices can serve for as long as they do. Is it fair to say that Chief Justice Roberts may not have an evolution in the same way that Justice Kennedy did?
He's not showing signs of evolving in that way of becoming.
But let me push back on that, because there were his rulings on that upheld the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare.
Right. Well, now I think that was consistent with things that he said during his confirmation hearings in terms of respect for precedent. He talked about, I'm here to call balls and strikes like an umpire. But he talked a lot about the importance of the institutional legitimacy of the court. The legal arguments against the Affordable Care Act, while they were politically persuasive to people who opposed the Affordable Care Act, they weren't really strong constitutional arguments. Had the court overturned the Affordable Care Act entirely, that would have been a fairly strong activist move. After all, that law had been passed by a supermajority in Congress after a big election win by President Obama. It's very rare for a court, even one that disagrees with the president, to actually overturn a major piece of domestic legislation like that.
Dr. Nelson, you were talking about the short list just a second ago, and one of the people who is rumored to be on this short list is Amul Thupper, who happens to have a local connection. He graduated from Ottawa Hills High School. What can you tell us about this short list, but particularly Amul Thupper?
I don't know a lot about his views in particular, but everybody on the short list is pretty similar in terms of their substantive views. They are pretty consistent on their views on economic regulation, on abortion rights, on voting rights and things like that. I don't think you would see big differences between any of those 25 people in terms of actual votes in practice. On the other hand, in terms of representation on the court, I think that he would represent a first for the court, and that would be something that would be historic in its own right, and that's a part of the appeal, perhaps, to the president of making that kind of a nomination.
One thing that I wanted to ask you about is this retirement does not go into effect until the end of July. Tell us what could happen from now to the end of July that could be incredibly consequential for America.
There's a lot of talk that Robert Mueller might issue kind of a preliminary report about the obstruction of justice part of his investigation into the Trump administration. We don't know what that report will say, if it will happen. We don't know what the president might do in reaction to that. But let's say the president did something like pardon himself. That would be unprecedented. We don't know if that's constitutional or not. It would be likely to end up in front of the Supreme Court, and that might be something that would end up in front of the Supreme Court on a very expedited basis, an emergency order.
And that's the question that I had. For a lot of us that follow it, it's surprising to think, unless you're a specialist, that a case could get to the Supreme Court so quickly. How does that happen?
Well, something that is Bush versus Gore is an example of something that had to be decided immediately, or that they thought had to be decided immediately, raced through the lower courts. The U.S. versus Nixon, the Pentagon Papers case, New York Times versus U.S., those cases made it to the Supreme Court almost directly because a timely response was necessary. I believe the Pentagon Papers case was maybe 6 days from start to finish. I don't know that something like that would come up in July, but I think Kennedy timed his effective date of his retirement so that he was around in case there was an emergency that required a full panel of justices.
Wanted to ask you about, in 2018, does the Supreme Court, whether it's 2018 or 1958, should it reflect America? And I am not just talking about representation as far as gender is concerned or race or ethnicity, but also political viewpoints. And after all, President Trump won the presidency, and Republicans control both houses of Congress.
Right. And I think there's a couple angles there. One is that we're looking at, with Trump's nomination to replace Kennedy, 4 members of the court will have been nominated by a president who lost the popular vote. So in terms of representation, there was a lot of talk before the election, well, we should let the people decide. And Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote by 3 million votes. The Electoral College, she lost, so she's not president. But if you want to say, is the Supreme Court reflecting the will of the people? Do you want to look at the Electoral College? Do you want to look at the popular vote? I mean, that's a debate that people are having. The other thing that people...
And I'm going to have to cut it off right there. Thank you so much for not just your expertise, but also your insight. Dr. Sam Nelson is the chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Toledo. We thank you.